Iran says it's poised to resume producing nuclear fuel in as little as 2 months, while the United States slaps yet more sanctions on the country and mobilizes warships. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says his country will stop complying with parts of the 2015 nuclear deal, but according to him, the goal is to spur negotiations rather than confrontation. He gave signatory countries a deadline of 60 days to agree on new terms to ease restrictions on the country's banking and oil sectors, or Iran would resume production of highly enriched uranium. This move comes exactly 1 year after US President Trump unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and as the United States is putting increased economic and now military pressure on Tehran.
Iran is saying enough is enough. After fully complying with the nuclear deal, known officially as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, was abandoned by Washington a year ago, it is taking steps towards renewing the production of nuclear fuel.
We are announcing a reduction of our obligations under the JCPOA. We are not leaving the JCPOA.
While not abandoning the deal, Iran is stopping sales of its stockpiles of uranium and says it will start enriching uranium again in 2 months unless the remaining signatories of the deal step up to their commitments. Those nations, the UK, France, Germany, Russia and China, want to do so, but Washington's threat of sanctions against those that buy any Iranian oil or do business with Iran has had a chilling effect on their trade with Tehran. As well as economic sanctions, Washington is stepping up military threats too, dispatching an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf, following what Washington called threats to US forces in the Middle East. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo cancelled a visit to Germany and headed to Iraq Tuesday, warning against any attacks on US interests there. Then he headed to London, where he said he will wait and see what Iran actually does.
They've made a number of statements about actions they threatened to do in order to get the world to jump. We'll see what they actually do. The United States will wait to observe that.
Meanwhile, Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif was in Moscow to meet his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Russia stressed the need to keep the nuclear deal in place and criticized Washington's show of force.
The United States' intention to send its aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf and in general to strengthen its military presence there, alluding to their readiness to use force. Unfortunately, this has become a pattern of conduct of our American colleagues, be it in the Middle East or the Persian Gulf or Venezuela. This is all regrettable.
Europe, Russia and China have all tried to create ways around the unilateral US sanctions, but Washington's control of the global financial system has meant that it's very difficult to do. Iran's economy is suffering badly, and the early promise of the nuclear deal is fading, and fears of a confrontation between Washington and Iran are rising.
So there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Here in the studio is Negar Mortazavi. She's a journalist and consultant editor at The Independent. From New York, Amy Holmes is a political columnist and commentator. And here in our studio, Brian Becker. He's the executive director of the Answer Coalition. And in Beijing, Qinduo Xu, senior fellow at the Pangoal Insitution. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you. Iran has been just the topic of the day. It's been difficult, actually, to keep up with all the news. Negar, I want to go to you and get your thinking about why this is happening now. But first of all, let's have a listen to Iranian President Rouhani in a bit more detail.
Our nation should know that we have not withdrawn from the nuclear deal. They should not think that the nuclear deal does not exist anymore. The nuclear deal is still in place, but today we will flip and show the other side of the coin. The nuclear deal has told us, its Articles 23 and 36, that if the other party violates it, we can also reduce our commitments at any level. Today, we announced a reduction, not withdrawal.
Now, Negar, Rouhani basically saying the other side, he means the United States here. But this move isn't really necessarily aimed at the United States who unilaterally withdraw. It's Europeans, it's Russia, it's China who have pledged to keep on buying Iranian oil and keep the agreement going, right? So what's happening here?
It's basically pressuring Europe to pressure the United States or stand up to the sanctions of the United States. Iranians have what they call been patient for a year since President Trump pulled out of the deal and then reimposed sanctions and now is cutting waivers for oil and even going as far as calling the IRGC a terrorist organization and all of the Revolutionary Guards, which is part of the official military of Iran, terrorist organization. So all of this has had economic repercussions, and Iranians were waiting for the Europeans specifically, and also other parties, China and Russia, to compensate, and they haven't seen enough, and they're basically saying our patience has a limit. So I think the key here is what President Rouhani is saying is this is not that they're not exiting the deal, but they're sort of pushing the edges or testing the limits of the deal and giving this 60-day deadline to the Europeans to basically use the Instex, the financial mechanism, or whatever other way they can to at least help with the buying of Iranian oil and other trade that they expect.
Yeah, because it's worth saying that Iran has actually been in full compliance with that nuclear accord up until now, and there are provisions that allow them.
Before President Trump pulled out, and also within the last year, they have been in compliance, yes.
I want to get to Amy Holmes. Amy, the US president, said as he campaigned that he thought this was the worst deal ever, that he was going to pull out. But he also said, coming into office, that he would like a better deal, one that included concerns about Iranian behavior in the wider Middle East, one that addressed missile technology and proliferation. But at the moment, we just see a lot of escalation rhetoric. Is the talk idea just gone away now? Is the end result here something military?
Well, we are seeing a lot of saber rattling on both sides, and something that has not been mentioned yet that I think is very important to point out is all the game playing. Now, the Iranian government says that their nuclear program has never had a military component. It has never been directed toward making nuclear missiles. They deny it up to this point. So then why the need for a deal? Why the threat that they will back out of the deal if they don't get what they want? If they're not making nuclear weapons and have no intention to and never did, then we wouldn't even need this deal at all. What Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said to the Iranians, yes, the United States is putting the squeeze on because we have intelligence reports that Iranian forces are planning to attack U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. CNN just reported that Iran shipped short-range missiles to Iraq. And then there's, of course, the ballistic missile program that is very problematic and Iran's mischief in the region. And the Secretary of State has said, let me finish, has said to the Iranians, we will lift the sanctions if you cut this out. And the Iranians don't want to.
Amy, I've kind of heard this script before in the run-up to the Iraq War, and there are people around the president, let's face it, including his national security advisor, that have made no secret in the past about wanting to basically change the regime in Iran. Essentially, is this what it's all about?
Well, I think that is the eventual goal, and it has been the goal of many previous administrations, including the prior administration, President Obama and President George W. Bush, the hopes that the Iranian government, whether they made significant, substantial reforms to their treatment of their own people, or that the regime itself was changed. But again, I think it's really important to state here that the Secretary of State has told the Iranians, it's true, we're putting the squeeze on, we're putting these sanctions on, we're backing out of this deal, but there's a simple way to end this, and the Iranian government has said no. I would also point out that the Iranians have also threatened that they are going to close off the Strait of Hormuz. Now, we all know that 30% of the world's crude oil goes through that strait. That would also affect 5 OPEC countries in that region. I can't imagine that Iran's neighbors are very excited about that.
Yeah, there has been saber rattling and statements, not always attributable to leadership, but yeah, you're absolutely right. There has been these statements. I want to go to China now because, for the JCPOA to survive, Iran needs money, and that means essentially buying oil, doesn't it, Qinduo Xu? Now, the US issued waivers, even though it's not really up to the US who buys what oil, but you understand that basically it will sanction countries, it says, who continue to buy oil now because those waivers have not been renewed. China, the biggest buyer of Iranian oil. Let's just listen to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before I get your reaction off the back.
China firmly opposes the U.S. implementation of unilateral sanctions on Iran and its so-called long-armed jurisdiction. We regret that the relevant measures taken by the U.S. have inflamed tensions about the Iranian nuclear issue. Maintaining and implementing the comprehensive agreement is a shared responsibility of all parties. We hope that all parties can exercise restraint, strengthen dialogue, and avoid the escalation of the situation.
So, Qinduo, there we have the words of the Chinese authorities. But in reality, can they continue to buy Iranian oil?
Well, China has been consistent and clear that it is against unilateral sanctions against another country, but it respects UN-initiated sanctions or whatever resolution over there. But at the same time, China does not pursue a policy to confront the United States. I think China is a bad choice. Obviously, the government is working with the European countries and the Russians to find a proper way to have Iran to continue to comply with the JCPOA, but at the same time try to make it workable. Because for Iran, they think, and also I think they deserve economic relief as part of the deal. Since the U.S. has withdrawn from the deal last year and imposing more sanctions on this country. So, the Iranian, their conduct has been, for example, strictly following this JCPOA, strict implementation of the treaty. That was been confirmed by every country and also by UN Atomic Energy Agency. So nobody is disputing about that. I think there's a deal. Iran is following the deal. Every other party should follow the deal. I think that's the Chinese position. But of course, if you look at the figure of last month, the Chinese import of oil from Iran actually peaked in 8 months, like 24 million barrels. But as tensions, military tensions has been heightened probably, and also the U.S. waiver came to stop earlier, like on May the 2nd. So it's not entirely clear whether China is continuing or not importing oil from Iran.
Yeah, we'll see that because there are lots of other oil buyers as well, including India, South Korea, Japan as well in the region. Brian, so we've seen this maximum pressure campaign. We've heard that with the DPRK before, but this one is really, really working, isn't it? Iran's economy is not in a good state. And we're seeing an escalation of rhetoric and military assets as well. What do you think the end plan is here for the U.S.?
Well, the Trump administration, using what could be only considered and called lawless methods, is trying to put maximum pressure not only on Iran, but on Germany, on France, on the UK, on Russia, on China, in fact, on the world, saying to everybody, look, we have the power in terms of the world market and the credit market and access to markets, such that we can determine that you must do what we want you to do. And what the Trump administration wants these other countries to do is violate an agreement that was signed with the Iranian government after years of negotiations. The International Atomic Energy Agency has said Iran is fully complicit with this agreement. The only entity that's not complicit is the Trump administration. Why did they want to trash the agreement? Not because Iran was out of compliance, but because they have a different agenda. And the agenda is to carry out regime change. One, that's illegal. That's a violation of the UN Charter. That's an act of aggression. The imposition of these economic sanctions are designed to use food and medicine to pressure and to deprive Iranian people of that which is necessary to sustain life. This is a rogue regime. The Trump administration has adopted the most aggressive, hyper-aggressive policy. Now, what's the outcome? Will China, will Russia, will Europe do what they think is right, that which is legal, that which is in their own national interest, or will they bend or bow to the United States? The Trump administration's calculations is we have enough economic and political and diplomatic power that they will ultimately bow, and as a consequence, we can isolate Iran. Again, a high-stakes game. Look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at what the United States has done. This is not a good outcome.
Amy, I just want you to pick up on that because Brian said the Trump administration, but we do know there are different voices within the Trump administration. And it seems that Iran has sort of been reaching out potentially directly to US President Trump, who, as you know, is the big deal maker and likes to sit down with adversaries, sometimes more than allies. Let's listen to the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Zarif.
They have all shown an interest in dragging the United States into a conflict. I do not believe that President Trump wants to do that. I believe President Trump ran on a campaign promise of not bringing the United States into another war.
Now, Amy, as you know, I'm talking about the hawks, Iran hawks in the administration, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, but Mike Pompeo too, the Secretary of State, and others as well, compared with President Trump, who doesn't, in fact, campaigned on getting out of Middle Eastern wars, even though Iran is not part of the Middle East. Do you see Trump acting as a brake here for any escalation?
Well, I think what we see often with President Trump is this good cop, bad cop, where the hawks make statements and then he says, well, I have a good relationship, with the individual leader that we get along. We've heard this, about President Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin for that sake, or even Kim Jong-un, and President Trump likes to be in that position of then negotiating the deal. I think it's really important to remember that it is in neither side's interest to get involved in a military conflict. And in point of fact, President Trump did campaign that he would not be entangling the United States in more Middle East military engagement. And there's frankly no appetite that I can see or many others for more military engagement in the Middle East, quite the opposite. So I don't see President Trump doing that, but nor is it in the interest of the Iranians to engage in military conflicts. That's why I'm saying that I think a lot of this is saber rattling. And in answer to your previous guest's question about how will Europe react, we've already seen their reaction, statements to the press saying that Iran's move has the potential to isolate it even further. French officials saying that if they proceed with this, they could actually face more sanctions from the other signatories to this deal rather than less.
Well, I mean, Pompeo was standing next to the British Foreign Secretary, and he kind of had to say that. But
a French official has also said this on the record. So
you're right.
I don't think we should be. I think we should be taking this seriously.
France has been pretty hawkish, and the deal nearly didn't come to fruition because of French objections early on. But Germany, of course, hasn't been consulted because Mike Pompeo, and this is where I go to you, Negar, cancelled a trip to Germany because he flew to Iraq, all swirling on what the administration have called this intelligence that they've got, that perhaps Iran is preparing to strike U.S. interests in the region, and they mention Iraq as well. You spend a lot of time talking to people in the Middle East. What's going on? Where do you feel this is?
Well, I guess we still have to wait and see evidence of this imminent threat that the administration was trying to basically portray. We saw the Daily Beast report of administration sources within the administration saying they have overreacted and overstated the imminency of the threat. And
that's never happened before.
Yeah, and we've heard this before. We've seen this in 2003 in the pre-Iraq invasion of the Iraq era, and we've seen the same people. I mean, John Bolton was one of the architects of the Iraq War. He has said in 2015, he has written about bombing Iran, attacking Iran's nuclear sites and regime change. He said it again in 2017. So John Bolton's goal is clear. He wants regime change. He's willing to go to war, and he's trying to pull President Trump into a war. Mike Pompeo, I think he's also on board with the regime change agenda. I don't think President Trump wants a war. He's promised to end the wars and avoid getting into new ones. But I think if this escalation continues and we're beyond just the game part, I think we've actually stepped into the escalation mode. And if this continues, the hawks in his administration might very well be able to pull him into some military conflict that can then also escalate further in the region.
Do you agree, Brian?
Yes, I do. I think also Donald Trump is beset with domestic problems. Nothing helps a candidate more than to be at war or almost at war with a foreign foe. Again, Iran is a convenient punching bag. It's sort of in the American political DNA right now. So John Bolton and Pompeo, I think they're having fun in a way, and they're also feeling that Donald Trump won't stop them. He's given them sort of a blank check to pursue this hyper-aggressive policy. So both sides will climb the escalation ladder because that's the nature of conflict. If one side aggresses or threatens aggression, the other side must take countermeasures. It's easy to get on that ladder. It's very hard to get off that ladder.
Okay, and there is an increasing risk of a misunderstanding too, as well. I want to move on to Venezuela, but Qinduo, just quickly, you know, with the whole U.S. control essentially of the international financial system, which has made things very smooth for a long time, there is increased talk about perhaps a de-dollarization somehow. Where does China stand on that? Because Russia has had its problems. The Europeans have tried to create special vehicles to allow investment with Iran, although companies seem to be balking at it. Are we looking at a big question mark in that sort of post-World War II financial architecture because of Iran?
Well, in terms of China-Iranian relationship, which is strong, and also Iran is one stop of the Belt and Road Initiative. But then immediate solutions is hard probably to be explored right now, and especially for China. But look at this long-term effects of the U.S. maximum pressure. Basically, I agree with my colleague, not only pressuring Iran, but also those big powers, China, Russia, and the Europeans. That will produce an effect. Many people are talking about another currency replacing the U.S. dollars. So RMB could be a choice. And there are there will be more activities, more business will be conducted and exchanged with RMB. Could be another viable choice to avoid the U.S. pressure now and in the future.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good point, and that's something really to watch because it's not really reported that often. Venezuela, I want to move on because that's another foreign policy crisis ever since the action in the last week or so where Juan Guaido, who's been recognized by about 50 countries as the legitimate government, while of course Nicolás Maduro still is president of Venezuela. It looked like there could have been some sort of coup attempt backed by the US, but it failed very quickly. Let's just, before I put a question to our panelists here, listen to Nicolás Maduro after that power grab attempt failed.
Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrams came out tonight saying that I was done, that I was on a plane going to Cuba, and that the Russians took me off the plane. They have come out saying that public servants have reached an agreement with them for a coup. Let me tell you, they have been fooled. The coup that was attempted yesterday, this coup skirmish was personally directed from the White House, from John Bolton.
Amy Holmes, strong stuff there from Maduro. What do you think? Was that right? Essentially, the US thought there was going to be a takeover by Guaido, and it didn't happen and it fizzled?
Well, we know that it fizzled, and that is a tragedy for the Venezuelan people, who are, facing dreadful straits in Venezuela and leaving in droves, starvation, mass poverty. It's not good news for the Venezuelans for President Maduro to be hanging on to power. But it's interesting, there's actually a domestic politics side to this here in the United States that a lot of Venezuelans are moving into Florida, have relatives in Florida, and that actually has something to do with the 2020 political map, if you recall, that no president has been able to win Florida for decades, become president for decades. And so this is kind of creating an interesting tension in the Democratic Party that you have Congressman Ilhan Omar, for example, who thinks that the United States is backing the other, but it's not necessarily great domestic politics.
Amy, sorry, I had to cut you off. We're limited on time. Brian, domestic politics aside, in the U.S., Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration, and it's not just Trump, Obama administration policy too was to overthrow and replace the Maduro government and to get rid of the other progressive leftist or left of center governments in Latin America. The reimposition forcibly, explicitly of the Monroe Doctrine from 1815, as if the United States has the right to be the policeman for all of Latin America. But yes, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, they're going for it. They're really going for it. And Bolton made the speech. This isn't just Venezuela, it's the troika of tyranny, meaning Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. The Bolton team, or President Bolton, let's call him that. Let's call him President John Bolton, has decided that these independent governments should be taken out. Now, that's completely contrary to Obama, who, while he had a stiff opposition to Maduro, was trying to normalize relations with Cuba. His argument was America will isolate itself in Latin America if it pursues the old Cold War policy. But that policy is the policy right now. January 23rd, failed coup. February 23rd, failed coup. April 30th, failed coup. Juan Guaido and John Bolton keep telling Donald Trump, it's going to happen this time, and each time it doesn't happen. But I don't think it will happen.
You can, say you don't agree with the U.S. intervention here, but also realize that Nicolás Maduro may not be delivering for his people as well. Where do you see the off-ramp here?
I just don't think that Donald Trump cares that much about people in Latin America. He says we have to intervene because we care about Latin Americans in Venezuela. Well, what about the Hondurans? What about the Salvadorans? What about the Mexicans? He's blocking them from coming in. You talk about people leaving in droves from countries. Well, they're leaving in droves from Honduras. Maybe the U.S. should overthrow the government in Honduras. No, wait, they already did that in 2009.
Brian, I know you know the history of the region very well. I'm going to just go for Qinduo Xu here because there is a big international aspect to what's going on in Venezuela. John Bolton has talked about Russians being on the ground, huge amounts of obviously Chinese investment and other investment in Venezuela. Where does the international community come in here?
Well, speaking to me?
Yes, sorry, Qinduo, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, for China, I think China obviously is against the regime change here. In one country or another. Yes, every country has its own problems, but Venezuela is basically fundamentally an economic problem. The government has mismanaged its economy, its oil resources, and it creates a lot of trouble for itself. But if U.S. truly want help them with economic means, but probably not this way with a regime change. Regime change does not mean that it will be a successful Venezuela. There are other countries. If you look at Paris, every weekend there's a yellow vest. There are big problems. The U.S. is not, every country has its own problem. Regime change is not the sole solution.
Yeah, I don't think the Trump administration have called for a regime change in Paris just yet, but we'll wait and see. Point well taken. Listen, I wish I had more time. We're going to talk about the TPRK and other stuff as well, but we have more programs in the week. Qinduo Xu, thank you so much from Beijing. Amy Holmes, thank you again. Brian Becker here as well. Negar, always great to have you on as well. All of you good friends of the show. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation does continue online. Join us at CGTN's America's Facebook page on this to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.